Hi Apex people, sorry I couldn't make the webinar tonight. I have 11 events this week after 5 p.m. and I'm having trouble juggling them all. So Lydia has promised to analyze this video and talk with you all about it. It's probably better and faster anyhow. So what I wanted to do is go over some thoughts after watching a ton of LD and talking with many LDers at the NCFCA National Open in North Carolina. This primarily focuses on that topic, but there are several items in terms of strategy and practice that I think span all topics that you'll ever debate, including probably if you have, say, a STOA tournament this weekend. So start with a quick story, which is that after watching Claire Downey in round one, we scrapped the case and basically wrote a new one from scratch that was more compelling and much simpler. We focused on having just one contention with a couple of subpoints, stating a very clear thesis with a clear position on both sides of the resolution, not just pro the affirmative side, but also taking into account the negative side more clearly. And then the fun part was we had two predictions at the end of the case that Claire used in compelling ways from app rounds going forward. What she did is she would say, she would predict first that the negative team would bring up only examples of equity being positive and contrast them to freedom being negative, and second, that all interpretations around equity would ignore the human factor of plans not going perfectly because humans are in the mix, in which case ideals about equity might not actually play out in the real world because they're not considering the human factor. She said that far more eloquently and succinctly than I just did. And in every round that I watched it, the predictions came true, and Claire used the predictions as actual reputational points in the middle speeches, and it worked incredibly effectively. So she would say, you know, my first response is prediction 1. Here's exactly why I said that, and you can see that that's going on, and so on. So that was a good story of improving an affirmative strategy, in my opinion, and showed that it's LD can be a lot more like Parley in that you can just rewrite your case pretty much on the fly and do really well. The key is thinking deeply about the topic and then learning to align and arrange your points so that you can be incredibly compelling and simple and clear all at the same time. So here are several, just I kind of have a bullet point list from my Evernote of ideas and things to talk about as the week went on at LD. So first of all, one important thing is to get to the bottom of whatever topic it is that you have. So for example, if the phrase realm of economics is in the resolution or the phrase Middle East is in the resolution, doesn't matter. The important part as a debater is to get to the bottom of it. I'll give you an example from work this week to show you what I mean. We are at work working on different product designs that have to do with software, trying to make the human conversation far more automated. So people today do a lot of research via surveys. We're trying to build software that's almost as good as or better than, in some cases, sitting across the table from someone and actually asking them questions and having a conversation. The biggest objection we have in the marketplace is, I already have a survey company. And to us, we aren't a survey company at all. In fact, we challenge that way of thinking. So to get to the bottom of it, what Nathan and I are doing right now is we're researching the entire history of surveys, because doing so will help us show the etymology of survey today and be able to compare and contrast. And it's interesting, we actually found one of the first recorded surveys in Western history is Charlemagne's survey of the Palestinian Holy Land, where they went around and tried to qualify which areas and churches needed money from Charlemagne because he wanted to be wise with how he provided funding and support throughout the area of Palestine. So it's super interesting, and we were able to now show the complete development of surveys all the way through the 60s was when really academia had a lot of innovations in the way survey science works, and then today how response rates are getting lower and lower, and the data actually may be very tainted because they're extrapolating from 10, 8% response rate what the other 90 or so percent of people think, and that may often mean you're just listening to the squeaky wheels, as it were. So for the realm of economics, that means you should each get to the bottom of it. You need to have a concrete theory on what the realm of economics is. Ask Claire to share the Google document with you that we started working on, where what we did was we went to SSRN and in quotes put in realm of economics and economic realm as two separate search terms and grabbed about 35 different journals that are using that exact phrase in the abstract and then downloaded the full phrase. I have that packet for you, and I've given it to Lydia so that she can give you the packet of the most interesting articles from that body of research. And what we found was the realm of economics is huge, because really economics is about decisions people make based on the things that they value. And in Western history, especially, economics has tended to focus around wealth because that's unfortunately what postmodernity has led us to value. But that's just one of many things, and in fact economists struggled to explain much of human behavior when it came to buying and commerce and travel and things like that without considering a wider net for what their values actually are. And so economics has incredibly wide-ranging implications, but you can make a list of things. So you can say the realm of economics includes these 7 domains, or you could say break it down by macroeconomics and microeconomics and say that the realm of economics includes microeconomics, meaning the decisions that individuals make on a daily basis, and macroeconomics, meaning how currencies, productivity, and large-scale economic numbers like gross domestic product are measured, controlled, and or manipulated. And then what would be awesome is by getting to the bottom of what is the realm of economics, you can use this for your interpretation. So, for example, when it comes to macroeconomics, freedom ought to be valued over equity. But when it comes to microeconomics, equity ought to be valued over freedom. Or freedom and equity never conflict in the microeconomic realm. They only conflict in the macroeconomic realm. My opponent's example after example after example are microeconomic rather than macroeconomic. I'm not saying you should use that particular argument. I'm saying that getting to the bottom of what the realm of economics is provides those sorts of arguments, and you need to construct a theory. I think many LDers at this tournament fell flat because they didn't really have a strong theory on what the realm of economics was, much less how freedom or equity played into it. Same was true for team policy. Many people were losing their debates as negative to little tiny whiny cases because they didn't have a greater theory or a grand vision for what the Middle East should look like. And so they ended up debating tiny cases on tiny terms, and you can't really succeed as a strategic thinker or a rhetorical speaker on such tiny ground. You have to make it about a bigger issue. So get to the bottom of the realm of economics: social, education, justice, markets. How do all of these relate? Are they all in the realm? Next, get to the bottom of equity in economics. It can't mean limited rights and all good things, I don't think. But that's what most negative teams who are succeeding seem to do, is they would say, well, freedom has these excesses, but equity is, and then somehow equate to limited rights. And by the end of it, as often happens in LD, both debaters are really agreeing that all values mean the same thing, which is just absolutely infuriating to watch when somebody, in previous years it'd be like justice versus liberty, and then they would end up saying they're the same thing. That's really what happened in too many rounds. Don't let equity mean limited rights. It can't and doesn't mean that. But most of the debaters seem to be glossing over the definitional aspect, providing zero analysis, and allowing equity to stand for whatever the negative team seemed to say it stood for. Okay, next. Let's see. Freedom. This is just a random thought, but we were thinking through how the resolution is kind of biased towards the affirmative in the circles that we have, and how could we unbias it? Well, one way to do it would be to actually focus on time. Instead of looking at value as based on which limits the other, which doesn't actually necessarily make sense to evaluate one thing being more valuable than the other on either side of limiting, or looking at it from which comes prior or which you choose more often, all of which don't necessarily mean that something is more valuable than the other thing. It just means you chose it more often or this time or whatever. Look at it in terms of prioritization in time. So, for example, to free ourselves from the British Empire, the American government emphasized free market economics and stated things like this is for a democracy is for a wholly moral people and it won't work elsewise. And de Tocqueville, when he came and studied America, kind of came to some similar conclusions and would be actually awesome to quote because he talks about economics. Um, but the idea is that if times have changed, then maybe freedom from tyranny, which isn't as high a priority, at least in our country and most Western democracies anymore, isn't as high a priority anymore as equity ought to be. Because the rich are getting richer while the poor are getting poorer. There is true income inequality in our country, and there's a massive issue of global third world debt, which is what we read that segment from the book on last Apex meeting that I was at. So there's a way to say now it's important to focus on equity, even though before it was massively important to focus on freedom. That would be a really cool way to look at valuation. You don't have to necessarily look at it in a vacuum. You could look at it today. Okay, next. What's this? Oh, I guess I accidentally got my notes mixed up a little bit, but here's just another example of getting to the bottom of it. Count the top 100 Google search results for something like economic realm in quotes, file type PDF, and see how many of them ever contrast freedom to equity. Okay, I guess this deserves its own bullet point. The idea is that on AF, this might provide more examples of where they do conflict, and on neg, maybe this provides more examples that they don't conflict very often at all. You're looking for, in the literature, what do people say is the conflict? Because that's going to not only have gotten to the bottom of the whole issues of the resolution, but give you tons of credibility when you can actually say, I went through the top 100 Google results on the economic realm, and any that talked about freedom, only 2 talked about equity, and this was the sense that they meant it. See, that's not a contrast. It doesn't contrast at all. That's why equity should not be considered lesser than freedom. It should just be considered on a different plane. That would be the type of conclusion you could make. Again, I don't know if that's the conclusion. Isaiah is not going to do your research for you. I'm just trying to help you see the type of research and thinking you need to be doing instead of theoretically thinking up more and more better and better arguments. That's not really working for you. Okay, next. Find legislation about equity that deals with economics. One thing that I found this week that was really interesting was called the Pay Equity Act. And it requires companies to explain pay disparities, enabling lawsuits. In other words, your salary information becomes something that everybody can know, and if, say, gender honestly doesn't matter in the example, though that's kind of the source of what people are saying, but who knows what it would find. If one person is being paid much less than another person, then they can demand an explanation and sue, have a lawsuit on the basis of that explanation. The Senate voted this down recently as something that they weren't going to consider, but there are tons of votes for it. This would be an example of the type of thing that equity really is. So go look at legislation that compares and contrasts equity and freedom, because just far too few debate rounds had any compare and contrast of equity and freedom at all. If they did, it tended to not be in the economic realm, and you want to be digging deeper and getting to the bottom of things. Okay. There's just one more thing that I want to say about value debate in general is when it comes to constructing a solid theory of valuation, there are so many ways to look at it. Start visualizing. Literally go draw on a piece of paper different ways to think about valuation. For example, for me, a pyramid with a line on it. First of all, if there's a top half and a bottom half, which one's more valuable? There are great arguments as to why the foundation is more valuable than what's on top, but vice versa, there are decent arguments for what you're trying to hold up is more valuable than the foundation. Or you could draw a line instead of bifurcating it, which hopefully we all did in our heads just there. What if the foundation is in fact very small or incredibly large, but the top is, let's say, gold or worthless? I don't know. Then that might say something different about how you value it. And this is all just in pyramid terms. You can look at any sorts of shapes, sizes, maybe graphs, numbers like 51%, 49%, things like that. Priority in time, which came first, which came second, which was a cause, which was an antecedent of subsumption, which is overall and a Venn diagram of other values, say general welfare, which takes up more area. There are lots of ways to look at value that your judges are looking for. So few debaters seem to include a theory of valuation as part of the round, and that's just such a substantial portion of what you're there to talk about that leaving that out seems really senseless. And so there were multiple rounds where I walked away. I really didn't know the thesis of the affirmative or the negative side. I knew they thought equity was good or freedom was good, but I didn't know the thesis when it came down to the full problem of the resolution. And so to get there, you need to have a solid theory of valuation. What most people do to construct that is they use a value. What was the most frustrating thing in Claire's loss in, I guess it was octafinals, was that it seemed that first the negative team had a value of, or the affirmative, excuse me, had a value of general welfare early on, but then later made the value be some theoretical construct. So in other words, it was first about actual content and substance, general welfare, and then later it was about which limits what. Does equity limit freedom or does freedom limit equity? If the which limits which debate is what determines value, then honestly and truly, having a quote-unquote value in your case is a useless waste of time. You see, you're looking at it on different planes, and you need to pick one plane and argue that that ought to be the plane and stand by your defense, or extrapolate from the other person what it seems they're saying ought to be the plane and support that, and then use that in the final speeches to close the round. That's what you need to do. Okay, closing story for you. Let me think of one. Oh yeah, this was great. This was when someone brought up slavery. I think it was this was double octafinals with Claire, and someone brought up slavery as an example, and we're trying to really pull on the heartstrings as Neg with this slavery argument, and Claire just said, wait a second, how is equality related to equity? Slavery was far more a freedom issue, if it even touches on economics, than it was an issue of equity. And he took the wind out of the sails of that example. Taking the wind out of the sails of examples is a lot easier than you think if you spend the time to listen to them and really analyze them. There were tons of examples like that throughout this tournament that they just could have completely been deflated if the debater on the other side was listening closely enough to prick the balloon. Okay, good luck. Have fun. Thank you. Bye.